Good morning. The General Academic Institutions Formal Advisory Committee meeting is called to order. My name is Noelle Sloan from Texas Tech University, serving as chair. Please be advised that this meeting is being broadcast over the internet and recorded, so I would ask all attendees to silence your cell phones. For those attending via teleconference, please mute your phone until you are ready to speak, preventing background noise. Thank you. Let's begin by calling the roll.
Mr. Brown. Miss Brown. Mr. Davidson.
Here.
Mr. Gallant.
Here.
Mr. Harper.
Here.
Mr. Keller. Dr. Kanukin.
Here.
Dr. Marquardt. Ms. Mendez. Dr. Murray.
Here.
Dr. Munoz. Mr. Tomlinson.
Here.
Ms. Sloan.
Here.
Dr. Strouser.
Here.
And Ms. Wright. And we hear that she's on her way, and there is a quorum present.
As a reminder, members on the call are permitted to vote. I'd like to welcome the committee members back. We'll begin the meeting by considering an approval of the minutes from the August 19, 2019 meeting. A draft is included on page 2 of the materials that were sent out. Do members have comments, questions, or corrections to the draft minutes? Hearing none, do I hear a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
It was a motion by Dr. Munoz and second by Ms. Susan Brown. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Thank you. The next item is discussion, review, and consideration of the Commissioner's 2022 to 2023 biennium charges. Charge 1, and let me just preface, I will be taking these out of order today. I think that in the interest of time, my proposal is to address charge 1, then skip to charge 3 and 4, and then at the end, come back to charge 2 as we've had a work group meeting in the interim and can report out on that at the end as that may require additional discussion. So again, beginning with charge 1 is to study and make recommendations for the appropriate funding levels for the operations support and space support formulas and the percent split between the utilities and operations and maintenance components of the space support formula. We determined at the August meeting that the full committee would address this charge together. I hope members were able to review the August and September agenda materials in preparation for discussion at today's meeting. To focus our discussion on page 6 of the agenda materials, staff provided a chart that displays growth in the appropriation amounts and rates over the last several biennia. Pages 7 and 8 provide projected growth rates for student headcount, space support, and inflation. And page 9 shows the projected funding level increases using these rates. I'd like to open it up for discussion on those items.
So Noel, I think others have noticed this as well, but for the formula funding recommendations for 2023, the small schools supplement is down.
I'm sorry, Daniel, is your mic on for those on the phone to hear?
It's on. Is it working?
Okay, I hear it better now.
Oh, there.
Yeah.
So for the 2023 formula funding recommendations, the small institution supplement is down from the $27 million level from last session to $15 million. So I presume that either a lot of schools grew or expected to grow out, or the methodology used for the 2022-23 is from the previous legislative session.
So during the legislative session this year, they added an additional $18 million to the small institution supplement. Whether we continue to advocate for the level that high, we would have to change the methodology of how we would or put more money into the methodology and be able to break it out that way. But essentially, they just added on an additional $18 million, and it didn't necessarily follow the exact methodology that we normally use to allocate small institution supplement.
Yeah, so I think for Texas State system, we spent a lot of time to get the new methodology, so we support that moving forward, so.
I'm about to say, I think since the legislature put the money in there, it would be my guess that they intended it to stay in there. So,
And certainly the University of North Texas system has a small regional university with a very important mission. These funds are vital to their mission, and our system would support having it retained within this formula recommendation.
Yes, this is Karen Murray from Tarleton. Likewise, the Texas A&M University system has noticed this and has concerns and would like to see it continued at the level the legislature provided.
So if I can follow up on that, I guess you have two approaches to handling this. One is just plugging in the dollars that the legislature appropriated, which wasn't based on a formula, or you could adjust the formula. So it'd be helpful to get some direction from the committee
So, I
on which
thought
of the two
it
approaches you wanted to
was based on a
take.
formula.
Adjust the formula?
No.
I mean, my understanding was that the legislature did adjust, the LBB adjusted the formula. There's a new methodology, a new formula for distributing the small institution supplement.
Okay, and when I believe, and Jennifer can correct me if I'm wrong, but she did have some discussions, I believe, with the LBB, and they didn't share that methodology with her.
So it was very similar to the way they allocated it, but if, the way we currently do it is the amount, where they, where we advocate for the amount for the 10,000, the step down from students 10,000 and less. And if the dollar amount is going to grow, we need to make adjustments for that in the formula or recommend how we want to do that. Or if we're going to just take whatever they appropriate and then allocate it after that, that's the question mark, I guess.
I think the legislature had testimony about the importance of the small institution supplement in its many meetings, and chose an appropriate number based on what they heard, what they believed, and what other institutions shared with them. And whether it's formula-based or not, I would like to find a way that this committee recommends that we retain the levels the legislature had.
I would see a couple of possible ways for us to lay that out for you to look at, and one would be, and please correct me if I'm wrong, thinking about the additional funds, but keeping the student counts structured in a similar way. And another would be to make adjustments to that model, which is, I think, what David was suggesting. So adjusting recommendations for the size of the institution, for example, that would receive the supplement. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So I think what I'm hearing from this committee, though, is that we would like to see that model with continuing at the 27.4 as done in the legislative session.
I might be so bold as to wonder why, if the other parts of the formula are supposed to be considered for inflation, why that would not be considered for inflation as well.
So based on the current methodology for size, but increasing the amounts as opposed to making changes in the methodology for determining what a small institution is? Because student, you can think about growth, and that our small institutions are, as they grow, you're going to have fewer and fewer who will fall into that category, or you can think about just increasing a rate in terms of the amount going to those that fall under the categories we currently have. I think that guidance would help us if you let us know how to think about that. And we'd be happy to do it different ways if you'd like for you to see.
I just might suggest that as we think about how to provide greater clarity to this question, there are some institutions that were small and have gotten larger, and they have the same demands being placed on them, but at a larger scale. And so we might think about not only enriching the small school supplement, but there may be mid-size institutions now, and how to provide them with a similar a pool of resources to continue the work that they've done, that they are doing.
And I guess my question had to do with, do you want to just stick with a static amount, which it sounds like that's what's being proposed. In that case, the amounts wouldn't change from biennium to biennium as institutions grew. Am I understanding that correctly?
I thought there is a tail on the small school supplement right now. So you get to a certain point, you get the full amount, and then above whatever that FTE amount is, then it trails down to zero.
Correct.
That's correct, because we lost ours this last year because we went over, or the last biennium, because we went over the 10,000.
Right.
It's kind of a,
It's not supposed to be a hard cutoff. It's
Yeah,
supposed to
there's a-
be
there's a-
kind of
It's
There's
a
a tail for it.
gradual, right.
So it starts at 5,000 students or less, you're getting the full amount, and between 5,000 and 10,000, it's a step down.
Okay.
And currently, the 5,000 student level, if they're below that, the amount is 750,000, and then
But with
steps
the
down.
additional 18 million, what did that come out to be this time?
I'm looking.
While you're checking for that, Jennifer, wasn't there consideration in the legislature to move above the 10,000 level? I think there was a bill or proposal, or at least discussion about that. Does anybody recall?
I had heard something similar,
Yeah,
Danny,
yeah.
about that, because, for example, and just in the case that Angie shared with us a minute ago, you're almost penalized for responding to the demands of 60 by 30 to grow and to educate more, and then suddenly you're above what is operationally, functionally different from 9,998 to 10,000 and 100. You're still delivering those services, but you no longer have the benefit of this additional support. So as we think about how to continue the work that institutions like Angelo State and others are doing to educate Texans, how might we identify a fund that would not erode this current fund, that would not erode this fund, but would provide a complementary fund for these now mid-sized institutions that are aspirant of the same goals of the state plan?
So many of the institutions did advocate for increasing the 10,000 head count limit during budget hearings, but I'm not aware of the legislature making a recommendation to change the 10,000 head count cap.
I think there was a recommendation. I think there was a lot of conversation about it. I think it's a valid point.
So again, to recap, I think this committee is asking to keep the small institution supplement at the 27.4 as it was in the last biennium. Do we also want to have further discussion on Bob Brown's comment of all the other have start with that appropriated rate and then adjust for the anticipated inflation rate?
Texas State supports that.
Yeah.
So move us away from the methodology that's been used in the past, and as David was mentioning, just move to here's what was appropriated in the last session for those schools, and here would be, and build in an increase for inflation. Is that or growth?
And so we like the methodology that was used in the 2021 appropriations bill
Yeah.
with inflation on top of that.
Daniel, can you educate us on what that methodology was for those that don't know?
I'll find it. I can't find it in my archive now, and I'll send it to you.
I pulled up the basis of legislative appropriations on the computer, so you can see it behind you. Rather than the 750 in the annual funding, once you added the additional 18.5 million that was appropriated, it took it up to, it's not a straight amount, but it's 1,133,133 was the, if they were under 5,000, getting the full amount, and then the step down occurs.
So was that based on students, basing it on 5,000 students for each of those?
It's
and
still
then-
based on the head count students, so it takes the certified fall head count. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, Texas State would like to use that methodology, but take the 1.3, add the inflation factor to it, and keep the tail above 5,000.
0.3, not 1.1.
So if I understand correctly, adding inflation to the lower limit of the small institution supplement.
To the 1.3.
Right, to the
1.6.
1.3.
And then that will then roll through on the tail side of it as well.
Okay, not to the actual head count number that they.
Right.
Okay.
And it will then taper after, between 5 and 10 still, but starting with a different base amount for those who are under 5,000. Okay.
Any discussion on the other operations support and space support, going with the methodology listed on page 9 of taking the last biennium's appropriated rate, increasing by the inflation rate, and then also increasing by the growth rate?
I think in the, I don't have a problem with the dollar amount, but I think in the explanation, we need to very strongly recommend against the Senate request from last time, which took out the online, or did online at 50%. And that would be part of the write-up.
So the recommendation is that this committee recommends supporting both inflation and growth rate, and also strongly recommends that there be no 50% discount for online.
Which we're going to address in charge 4.
Okay.
I have a technical favor to ask the committee. Whenever the coordinating board produces their basis for the legislative appropriations request, as y'all know, Sol Ross has 2 institutions, Sol Ross Alpine, Sol Ross RGC. On the formula proof for utilities, Sol Ross is captured as one entity, and I need either to add a second line that says Sol Ross Rio Grande College, or a parentheses after Sol Ross to say that it includes both Alpine and RGC. So the cost will be $180,000 for the biennium, but right now, the LBB, when they do their methodology, they assume that RGC has 0 utilities because their name is not included on this spreadsheet. So they are getting no credit for utilities.
Does, if I can ask a follow-up question, do they lease all their space? And if so, are
lease.
utilities covered in that lease cost?
They lease 100% of their space through a triple net lease, which includes the cost for utilities in the lease payment.
So they don't pay any utilities directly, is that correct?
They pay their utilities through their triple net lease.
Through the lease, okay.
And then I will plead for support.
So just for my clarification, it is, Sol Ross RGV is a separate recognized entity. To me, it would make sense as a separate line and not combined. I don't know if you have a preference between the two.
I'm up for either one, so.
I do think because they are paying utilities, everybody pays utilities. I don't care if it's through a lease or not through a lease. You're paying those utilities, so I would think they should get funding for them.
And Jennifer pointed out, we did send it over that way in terms of with the utilities included.
Yeah, so in
for-
the formula proof that we look at here, it includes it in there, but
Yeah.
because it's not in a separate line, the LBB has just multiplied it by 0, and so,
Does the coordinating board have any preference on separate line versus including it
I
as
believe
combined?
we do have it as a separate line, but when it gets over to the LBB, I guess they don't have a I guess they combine it over there.
So we can make in our recommendation to retain it as the separate line.
I think we could put that, that verbiage in the explanation.
I'll support that as well, if you're looking for acknowledgement.
So I don't know if there's any motions coming out of this discussion that we can formalize at this point, if anyone would like to make a motion on that.
I move that, we have a separate line for Solross Alpine and Solross RGC in the formula data that's provided from the coordinating board to the LBB for utilities.
Second? Second?
I have a
I will-
question before the vote.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm just curious, well, do you think there might be other systems that have similar sort of,
So we spent some time with this, and this is.
we might want to add them, right, if in the event?
But it's only RGC that's not included on the infrastructure tab for the formula, so.
Right.
I would add to that, Daniel, that we also make a recommendation that the LBB, since the coordinating board did it that way last time and it got ignored, that we make that recommendation that they use it that way also.
I'm fully supportive of that, as you can probably imagine.
I kind of figured you might be.
Okay, there's been a motion by Daniel Harper and a second by Bob Brown. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Oh, sorry. And opposed. All right. Let me just see. I guess we'll wait on data for the small institution supplement, and then at the next meeting, we can conclude the proper projected funding levels for inflation and growth for all of them combined, if everybody's okay with that moving forward. Okay. All right. Thank you. Move on then, like I indicated, we'll skip charge 2. Moving to charge 3 is to review the space projection model as it relates to distance education courses, including the different physical space and technology needs between traditional courses, online courses, and distance education courses, as well as information on associated costs of each course type and recommended changes to the space projection model. Ms. Gonzalez emailed us the initial and final space models that the coordinating board submitted to the LBB that provided adjustments for distance education. Hopefully, committee members were also able to review additional information on page 11 of the agenda materials. I'd like to open this up for full committee discussion with the goal of reaching the recommendation without the need of an additional work group on this charge.
So, I think Texas State System's belief is that online education currently is more expensive to provide than face-to-face, and I think Dr. Marquardt is far more qualified to talk about it from our perspective.
Good morning. Again, Jim Marquardt. And I don't know if, I'm from Beaumont, and I don't know if you've been tracking the news here. I think our friends in Houston would know that we've taken on more than 36, 40 inches of rain in the last 24 hours. And so I'm in touch with some people. They're trying to get to campus, but they're being blocked as a result of the highways, et cetera. But the point is that our face-to-face, how ironic that we talk about online today as a result of this. But the facts are that, I'm taking on water in my chemistry and my biology labs. So the face-to-face operation obviously is going to be postponed today, tomorrow, and who knows, maybe even into Monday. But what I do want to say is, and I've prepared a few words here, if I beg the indulgence of the committee here, that online instruction, the cost of it appears to be low because there is no physical room, okay, or seats. But online education, it is unstructured, obviously. It's not like the face-to-face, which is very structured, very time-bound, and across 15 weeks.
So with online, it's unstructured with few time constraints, and students seek help or assistance at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday or a Sunday, or they need tutoring at night, again, on Friday evening, Saturday, or Sunday. So the needs of these students, many of whom have families, they have jobs, and they can't sit for 60 minutes in a traditional classroom. So many online courses are delivered in 8-week blocks, and the instructor must be available 24/7, 365 to respond to student inquiries, and we make them do that within 24 hours. So again, the cost of instruction appears to be low, but online programs invest, and you need to know that we invest heavily on the front end, and that's in the marketing side of it, that's in the recruiting, and call centers. So we have call centers operating to contact students. Again, that's the retention service that we deal with, to respond to students, and additional admission personnel and transcript evaluators behind the scenes to support student enrollment. And once the student begins an online program, we provide tutors to be available to them, along with dedicated IT personnel for log-on issues that always crop up. And we even have online librarians to help our students, particularly graduate students. And again, while many courses are pre-built and they're ready for enrollment, but to build out a new course or update older ones, it takes instructional designers, soundproof studios with videographers and sound technicians, and we even offer closed captioning services for our students. And most of all, our faculty. They invest significant time upfront to develop and maintain their courses, and we subject them to a program that's called Quality Matters. That's a course evaluation process that checks course objectives, content, and content age, along with the relationship between the content and the objectives. So the infrastructure to support this costs us millions. Okay, millions of dollars to do this, and most people don't see it. It's the classic Wizard of Oz. Pull open the curtain, and that's what you're going to see behind it, are all these other infrastructure or ancillary costs that go along with a quality program. So online admissions also occurs throughout a calendar year, and I just wanted the committee to be cognizant of that as well. So while Lamar, for example, received formula funding in 2017 for about 14,400 students, over 19,000 actually took a course, if you look from January 1st through December 31st. We enroll them all the time, okay? So across that same time period. But I checked some of the data that the coordinating board has on online growth in Texas, and there were 358,000 university students, or 15% of all courses were online in 2015. That number went to in 2018, it went up to 510,000 students, and it's now over 20% of all course offerings. And indeed, so I just want the committee to be aware of these behind-the-scene costs, and the idea that online is going to play a pivotal role in meeting the 60 by 30, particularly with as it relates to adult learners, so we can bring those people back and finish them off. A lot of them have 76 hours or 92 hours, so the online component is going to be critical for us to meet those completion objectives. So I don't have it all detailed out, but I could work with our CFO on campus and provide detailed information probably in the next couple of weeks about real costs associated with all the personnel that goes beyond to get this done. So, yeah, you see a faculty member at a on screen, but it's all the things behind it that you can't, and it costs a lot of money to get it done. We just need this to be considered. Thank you.
Dr. Marquette, I appreciate those comments. I think that a lot of us agree that there are substantial costs behind providing online courses, and that's one of the concerns I have, is that we've never really documented or put, pen to paper on what all those costs are, or even what the future looks like as additional types of courses are offered online. I think there's a lot of difference even in cost when we have face-to-face in the different types of courses that are taught, the different the majors that are taught, and that we could see those same types of cost differences when you're teaching online as well, that is the future of online. I know Mr. Davidson has some comments.
I just want to say I agree 110% with everything my colleague Dr. Marquardt said. He said it much better than I could, so I appreciate that. And I would also like to add that 2 years ago, we included competency-based education hours into the formula in a way to incentivize thinking about how we reach the goals of 60 by 30 differently. And I think if we discount the online hours in this part of the formula, then we're actually doing the opposite of creating those incentives. So I would prefer we did not do that.
University of North Texas is a large provider of online education. As a matter of fact, undergoing now a major revision to most of the stuff that we're teaching to make it more responsive to the newer sorts of technologies, increasing expenses for us in making sure we're delivering a quality product in a way that students are used to encountering technology now rather than kind of, we could put your old Indian tablet notes online and do a little talking and have an online course. They're completely different now. We certainly support online education getting the same consideration as other courses.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. Just very quickly, Noel, and others know this as well, but to Mr. Brown's point, we know the expense right now, but you look at these instructional designers, how competitive they are in the market, what their salaries might be. We look at these media site carts that we used to bring into our classroom. What will that technology be and what will it cost in the future? I mean, we're sort of gauging current expenses and maybe not fully estimating the significantly greater cost in the future to deliver this kind of content in this way with the kind of pedagogical efficacy that we expect. To not have some consideration of the cost today only imperils our ability to cost it correctly in the future.
So at UT San Antonio, we are broadening our program offering, and we can tell you, we concur that the costs are not necessarily one-to-one to the traditional cost of instruction. It also relates to student success, right? It's about being able to keep the students engaged and help them throughout their course and like their classes. It's not at the traditional hours and offerings that we have. And so we could quantify very specifically what those costs are to implement, and broaden our programs. I support that we get the full funding for the space allocation or that we make that recommendation. But I also wonder if we should have an alternative proposal that it doesn't relate to space, because that's really where probably the problem lies, right? The virtual space where these classes occur don't necessarily relate to the square footage that we have allocated for the instruction. What we're worried about is the cost. So perhaps we could think about another way that we could actually acknowledge the additional costs that did not relate to space. I'm not sure what that is, but that might be something for us to think about.
And I can go back and think about why a proposal to reduce distance ed seems reasonable to folks who are not doing that every day. Because you'll use the same intellectual material over and over again. So the notion is that delivery should be less expensive. And that's, that's a reasonable conclusion to draw if you're not in the trenches every day. And you're not having to redo these courses to make sure they're appropriate for new learners. And now the need for the 24-hour response from your faculty, the need for beginning to put in more intermittent measures of success so students can progress through these things using game theory and other things so that they kind of know where they are and know when they need to repeat. The technology takes them back to repeat things. And so, it was a understandable, I think, question to ask us. Why would you not reduce some of the space allocation formula? But I think if need be, I think the committee can do a sensitive response, acknowledging that that's a good that there's a reason someone might come up with that judgment. But I think the distance ed is a new game in town, and it has more expenses than you would see on the surface.
I agree. I mean, our faculty members actually have to go through additional training before they teach an online class because it is so different than the traditional class. And so that's an added expense, but it all goes towards making sure the students are successful. And so I think there's a lot of different things, and you're right. You don't put an online course just out there one time and then never touch it again. Because as the students change, you're changing that course and with the new technology. So I think those are all very important things. I kind of am intrigued by the idea of a separate formula. I just don't know how we get there. Right? I mean, I like the idea, but I think it's, I have to think about that one.
I think as, Dr. Munoz had stated and Ms. Mendez, is that we currently don't know what technology all is going to be coming and how that may impact our costs. As we know, a lot of our IT and software costs are probably one of the most exponential growth in our budgets. And so would it be appropriate for this committee, in addition to, as you voiced earlier on the strongly recommend against a discounting in that, say that we believe or would recommend a future formula advisory committee, again, taking up the consideration of what, if it would be appropriate to consider a different formula for online courses?
I think that's a great idea.
Can I,
Especially on the infrastructure side.
Yeah, I agree.
just one thing to think about, if you're thinking about a different formula for online education, we would probably need to do a cost study that would incorporate that, and therefore we would need information from the institutions broken out for online versus face-to-face. I'm not sure if institutions have that data or that capability, or if that's something they would want to consider. I'm not sure what the cost of developing those data systems might be, but that's something certainly to keep in mind.
And I would just, in clarifying, I'm not sure we were talking about for the entire thing, but just for the infrastructure
Formula for
section of it,
space.
for the space part, because you're not using the quote-unquote classroom space, but you're using dollars in a whole different way, and probably more dollars in a different way. So I was thinking just on the infrastructure side, not a whole new cost study. There would be additional elements, obviously, that would need to be collected, and my CFO might kill me, but I think that would be a good idea.
I agree with Susan's perspective, yeah. It's related to the
I'd also
cost.
like to point out that there are a number of us that offer a lot of our courses hybrid in between that bear both sets of support costs. And in fact, if you're looking at very engaging and pedagogically sound things, that subset is actually growing.
I would add, too, that depending on the program of study, there are other space costs. So, for example, the majority of our online students are in nursing programs, and they still have to have the clinical space, which we have to find them somewhere near where they live. A lot of the for-profit universities are paying for that space now, and so we kind of anticipate that we may have to pay for that space in the future. Testing services for those students is the same way. So there are some physical space requirements. And one of the largest cost increases we've seen with those students is for students with disabilities, and finding a way to assist them in the location that they're in, which is more expensive because they're not there on the campus with us. Just some other considerations.
I'd like to add one other thing. I appreciate all the comments. It's wonderful, and I know, Dr. Munoz, you were talking about future anticipated costs and again, providing the lab space and the clinical for all that. But another one is going to be related to like financial aid, and that's going to be the identification of the person taking the class. So if you don't have that ready, then if you're audited by the Department of Education, you got big trouble. So it's the cyber, it's that related technology cost, the identification of the person that's just going to get continued sophisticated as well as costly as we go into the future, and we really need to take a look at it.
Right, so to Susan's sort of elegant point, it's all of the infrastructural requirements for the delivery of this content on our campuses in this, using this modality. And the cost is not going to decrease.
Yeah, it's not going to decrease, and nor does it not exist.
Nor does it not exist. Absolutely.
I wonder if we could be more artful on our recommendation rather than proposing against, proposing for all of the hours provided by distance ed being supported at the same as other hours.
I agree 100%, and I think you said it very well, that we should acknowledge why this became a question and then answer the question with all of this. I think you said it very well.
So I will try to write up those words and present it to the committee at the next meeting for motion and approval.
Thank you, Nicole. Noel.
All right. Next is charge 4. That is to study and make recommendations for an outcomes-based methodology for allocating the balance remaining in the Beyond Time account after the underutilized amount is allocated. During the last 2 biennia, the Formula Advisory Committee recommended a graduation bonus methodology to address outcomes-based funding. Has anyone thought about how we might want to address this charge?
Can I have a little history on this? Because there was originally a proposal to return it to the institutions that didn't spend it. And then it became, at least sometime during the legislature, in play perhaps for their performance funding. So can we understand kind of how we got here? Can anybody help us with that?
I'm thinking John Wyatt would actually be the correct person to do that. Let me see if he's available, because I can fill in a lot of the pieces, but there's a few missing pieces in terms of what happened at the session. So let me see if he can join us. He was going to be listening in, so just a minute.
I have a question. As schools contributed, right, and then this balance accrued for any number of reasons, couldn't just a simple calculation of how much was put in, how much you have, and then some?
I think it's twofold. So we did negotiated rulemaking 4 years ago for the balance of the funds that were
Turn your mic on.
for the balance of the funds that were in the Treasury. And the legislature appropriated that funds out. We had negotiated rulemaking, and effectively what it was is those donor schools got their relative share of that amount back. Now, I don't think the allocation methodology was ever approved by the LBB, so the funds stayed in the Treasury. And I thought this was for the remainder of it, which was the funds, I think, returned from the students who originally qualified, but their grant converted to a loan. And so the question is, how do you want to allocate this final piece of it? So the packet says they're estimating it to be 26 million, but I don't know when the program would end. I thought when we met with John during session, it was 10 years from the last award, something like that. So,
Yeah, I think that seems pretty accurate.
shockingly for me.
Yeah, so, but
What a memory.
we'll see if John's able to join us, but yeah, I think the gist of it is that there are some additional money still coming in, even after what was allocated based on the negotiated rulemaking happened. And so because the committee is always in right or charged with looking at performance-based, outcomes-based funding and making recommendations for that, I believe that's part of why the commissioner wanted to make sure there was a charge where the committee would be looking at that, and thought that this was some money that was going to be available. The discussions had already begun in terms of this committee recommending 2 years ago the graduation bonus. Of course, it sort of morphed into graduation supplement during the session, but the idea being wanting folks to think about there is that additional money and the importance of thinking about the 60 by 30 text plan and wanting to reward institutions for having positive outcomes for students, especially students who are considered at risk. So
Yeah, and I kind of presume the committee really has two big things to factor. One, what's their belief on the Beyond Time funds? And then subsequently, what's their belief on an outcomes-based model? So.
And here's John. On speaker for a moment for the committee. They're just talking about the Beyond, we're talking now, I'm with the committee members now, we're talking about the Beyond Time funds, and we wanted to be very clear on, in terms of what happened at the end of the session, the remaining funds, that I think was approximately 26 million, how we would characterize that. And yes. Yeah, I think that makes sense, though, in terms of those two pieces, and we will provide detail for you. And he may be back before the meeting is over. He stepped out to get some lunch. I knew he was going to be listening. So I think thinking about those pieces makes sense. You've got the Beyond Time funds, remaining funds, and then you've got the charge to the committee that's in rider to think about outcomes-based funding, making recommendations related to outcomes-based, performance-based funding, and this charge kind of links those two pieces together.
Right, and one of the things I would like to raise is when they looked at RGV for the data for the unspent Beyond Time money that institutions had put in, they lumped UT Brownsville and UT Pan American together. And instead of saying, okay, UT Brownsville is going to get the part that they had put in back, they just said, okay, it all got wiped. And so I would like to make the case that the amount of money that UT Brownsville students had put into the fund, but are not illustrated in what was coming back to the institutions, that UT Brownsville's part of the money come back to UTRGV.
So Brownsville was a recipient and Pan Am was the donor, or did they?
No, Brownsville was the donor.
Was the donor.
Brownsville was the donor, and then Pan Am was a recipient, but because UTRGV was not in place when Beyond Time ended, then in the discussions somehow, and I was not part of those discussions, they got put together. And so I'm making the case that Brownsville money should come back to be used for financial aid or whatever purposes to help students.
And I think that the rulemaking committee that started 4 years ago and looked at that, I have no I have no objection to splitting Brownsville out, but I think what the work that committee put together and the recommendation they made on the, proportionate allocation back to the donor institutions made sense. And I don't know that, at least I think there hasn't been anything to change that theory since that time. I think it still makes sense to have that same, apportioned allocation back to the donor institutions.
I agree, but UTRGV was not in place, so the donor institution was Brownsville.
And I have no objection to running through that calculation with Brownsville broken out.
Okay.
Same here.
Well, nor do I. Part of that group, I don't know that we specifically talked about that circumstance. We knew it was kind of on the horizon, but I don't think anyone consciously made a decision to do that. I think it was just structural in the calculation. So are we legislatively bound to tie this to performance-based funding?
And I don't have.
That was really the nature of my question.
I don't
to
have the
start with.
rider in front of me, but it does, it's 61053. Okay, so it's on the, do you know what page it's on? It is in the rider that the committee is asked to look at. Oh, I'm sorry, it's in the statute. Okay, it's in the statute that the committees are asked to consider it, and we can get you the language. In fact, that might be what David's looking for right now. The other thing I could suggest is maybe we continue with this discussion, and hopefully Mr. Wyatt maybe will return, and we can fill in some of those details, and we can find the statute, or it could be continued at the next meeting, and we'll make sure that we have the folks here who can answer some of those more detailed questions.
Yeah, as someone who was the enlightened self-interest of the North Texas system, University of North Texas system, we would have a fairly decent return of money that was not, that our students paid, that would now be parsed out to the other state institutions, including those that used all the money. And so I think before I take a position, I'd kind of like to know where my legislative hands are tied.
Sure.
Okay. So since there's a need to have a better understanding of what the statute and rider and legislative requirements are, as well as how we got there at the end of the legislative session, we'll hit pause on that one and come back to it either later today or at the next meeting when we have those details available to share. So that being said, we're ready to jump back to charge number 2, which is to review the expenditure study that is used for the cost matrix, including determining and reviewing the growth of costs affiliated with higher education and its consequent impact on higher education institutions, and make recommendations for improvements to better reflect the actual expenditures of the institutions. Dr. Danny Gallant is leading a work group to address this charge. Dr. Gallant, will you please provide us an update on the group's work thus far?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll mention that on September the 9th, we had a conference call. I think most were able to participate on that call. We discussed some of the questions that had emerged from our discussions, both from our institutions and I think from the group as well. One of the things that we really focused on during that conversation was the allocation of departmental operating expense, or DOE. And I think everyone knows the formula. I'll just say it so I can make sure I stay on track. But total instruction plus research, then minus teaching salaries, minus teaching assistant salaries, leaves us the DOE module to allocate. And we examined some information that Jennifer and Julie had provided from the coordinating board that showed that across time, there had been quite a bit of variance in the methodology used to allocate DOE, but it seems in the most recent past, most of us were allocating by faculty salaries. Dr. Juan Munoz raised a question about analyzing data which showed the allocation of SCH versus faculty salaries. Jennifer provided that for us. That information, I believe, is at your table. She's provided that. So, Dr. Munoz, before we talk about the general agreement of the working group, do you have a comment on this allocation methodology?
The spreadsheet helps to clarify my question and just to see the relative impact from one possible formula or to the other.
Great, perfect. I think the questions we've asked among ourselves and of the working group and of the full committee are very good. It helps us to better understand the process because many of us don't live at this very granular level of detail, and it helps to be able to examine the methodology. And I'll say thanks also to Jennifer and Julie for the responses, feedback, and for the data you've provided. So, Dr. Munoz, from that perspective you just offered, I would suggest to the full committee that there was general agreement among the working group that we would like to see, and I don't want to be presumptuous. If I'm being presumptuous, please stop me. But I heard what I thought was general agreement among the working group that we would commit to an allocation methodology that was consistent, using a direct allocation of DOE where possible, with a balance of DOE being allocated indirectly by faculty salaries. So I'll open it up to our group and make sure I'm not presuming something that you didn't recommend or we didn't discuss. Hearing none, Madam Chair, I would recommend from our working group that we propose the consideration to the committee of a consistent methodology of allocating departmental operating expense, which includes a direct allocation where possible of DOE expenditures, with a balance remaining of DOE being allocated by faculty salaries.
So,
Do I need to make that in form of a motion? I so move that we develop a consistent methodology and recommend that for coordinating board funding, that we allocate DOE directly to the extent possible by institution, with the balance remaining to be allocated indirectly by faculty salaries.
I'll second.
all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Madam Chair, the second topic that we discussed a little bit, at least discussed electronically, if not in person, I think some of us have had conversations about this, was the inclusion or exclusion of non-funded semester credit hours, those being excessive hours and three-peat hours. And I've had conversations offline with coordinating board staff, both with Julie and Jennifer, specifically more with Jennifer, and it turns out that there is an exclusion of non-funded hours in certain element of cost calculations in the expenditure study. And I will speak, personally, I won't speak for the working group, nor certainly for the committee in this regard, but from my perspective, it makes sense to me in the expenditure study that we capture all expenditures that are related to academic delivery. So that's my basic perspective. I asked Jennifer to provide some information. You have a copy at your table. The title is Funded SCH as a Percent of All Undergraduate SCH at Texas Public Universities for fall of 18. I just went through this morning, made some notes. For SFA, we have 3% unfunded, but if you look at Sol Ross, Rio Grande, they're 6% unfunded. A&M Central Campus, 6. Corpus Christi, 6. Kingsville, 6. UH Downtown, 10. So there are a lot of institutions whose unfunded semester credit hours are not flowing into all components of the expenditure study. So my perspective is, and I think at this point we just have, for a topic of discussion, how do we feel about the exclusion of those hours in the expenditure study? Unless I'm missing something, my perspective is all hours should be included in the study. So, Madam Chair, I'll open it up for discussions.
Thank you, and I welcome comments by the full committee. I tend to agree with what Dr. Gallant has shared, in that there are definitely costs associated with all of those hours taught.
Can I ask a question? And I may have misunderstood when we talked earlier, Danny. The expenditure study, I believe, captures, maybe not all the hours, not the courses that are online, out of state or whatever for those students, but for most of your courses for the students that do the three-peat and the excess hours, the instructional cost and all of that is included, is my understanding. It's just that when you divide that total cost by the semester credit hours, those semester credit hours are not included. Am I right?
It may be exclusive only to the institutional support and the student service elements. Have to turn to the experts here. Jennifer, can you help?
And, we went back, and in terms of when you asked the question, we weren't looking at what Susan just raised. We just looked at, I think, in terms of when it was, what it's divided out by. Like you said, they're not included when we divide out those costs, but in terms of those costs going in, we need to look back at that, because I believe some of them, obviously some of those costs would get added in, because you're not removing them in terms of faculty members.
Right, because if you
I
have a
believe
student
the
who's
all
doing a
funds is
three-peat or
included.
an excess hour, the faculty member is in that classroom, so all that faculty costs.
Right,
and all
they'll
the-
still be tied to it, but it'll be, the semester credit hours of that student wouldn't be dropped in.
Right.
Is my understanding.
yeah.
So I think,
That's some more.
is that accurate? Right, so that it's, so I think maybe we misled you a little bit, because when I first heard this, I was thinking that there wouldn't be involved in any piece, but of course, when you're adding your faculty salary information, your other information, it's going to be divided out by the semester credit hours of those students who are getting funded. So actually, it's going to reflect all of the expenditures. It's just in terms of the semester credit hours, it's going to be a slight reduction in those per semester credit hour. That makes sense?
My only concern is that we just ensure that we capture all academic delivery costs. If we do that.
Right, and I believe it should do that, but we will go back and look in a little more detail about how all those pieces worked.
And it may be in the two elements of cost that include institutional support and student services. I'm not sure that those reflect those hours. Am I correct, Jennifer?
So I think when the costs are broken out in instruction and research in the 5 different categories, it's all funds. So when I was giving this data here on this chart, this was more about looking at how we allocated the salary over those different students. But as far as which costs come in, I believe all costs come in. It's an all funds amount. So the cost would be included. It's just that we're not using semester credit hours for those that are unfunded or three-peat excess hours.
Non-funded SCH.
But you're able to run some reports for us that'll just explain the.
We'll try to confirm, we'll confirm that, yeah.
Because I think one of the questions we have is from the CBM reports, are there expenditure data, I guess the question would be, are there expenditure calculations that don't reflect all of the data that are being pulled from the CBM reports?
Yeah.
That's kind of the question.
No, we can check that
Okay.
and
Thank
see
you.
if there are costs that are left off, expenditures that are left off because we drop off those semester credit hours that weren't funded, or if in fact the costs are coming in a different way so that we capture them.
I'd like to just underscore Danny's point. Just intuitively, I can't imagine that there would not be costs. So just more accurately capturing that for these unfunded SCH, particularly.
And I think they are, but
Who fills out our form.
we'll go back and take a look and just confirm exactly the details of how those are handled.
Yeah, one other point, as we looked at the percentage, I want to just underscore the point that it's not only about percentage, but it's about volume. If you
Yes,
talk about
absolutely.
excessive hours, most of those come at the upper level. We're talking junior, senior level, so it could be a significant impact
For
on many of our
undergraduates.
campuses, if not all. Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and that's certainly something we can,
I think those costs are included. So basically, you're dividing by fewer semester credit hours. So your cost per semester credit hour is actually going up.
It's going to show higher cost per SCH if Susan is correct and we go back and if all the expenses are getting in there and it's being divided by just those SCHs that are funded, that's going to show higher costs. But if there's other costs that aren't even getting in, then we'll have to take a look at that.
Okay. And what about Julie? I'm going to talk with our staff as well and make sure there's some additional information that I need to provide to you and at least ask a question about. So
Yes, no,
we'll just have some
absolutely.
additional conversations. Again, thank you all for all the reports you've run for us and all the conversations we've had about this.
Susan, I want to try to wrap my head around this, and I don't know that I can, but I might have to think about it a little bit longer. But so if we have all the costs captured, but less hours dividing, that's a smaller denominator than actual, so it's increasing the cost. Could that be a contributing factor on pulling it down to the lower level liberal arts if we have those introductory courses being repeated by students? I'm trying to think of
If you had
if this is
if you
impacting
had a
it.
huge number of students repeating those lower level liberal arts, it might increase that cost. But as Danny said, the excess hour students are probably going to be your juniors and seniors. Just guessing.
That'll be the excess hours, and I don't know which this
Hours could be.
like the 3P
I have
could be
no
your
Be all over the
calculus
board.
class, or the first classes they're taking coming in that they're having to do the
That might be a
3P.
question of how many of those three-peats, non-funded because of three-peat hours, and off of the S you could get this, but the unfunded three-peat hours, how does that go across levels? And I haven't looked at it, so I don't have any idea.
And then maybe an additional question, the excess hours that, for discussion's sake, would likely occur at the upper levels. Do then they flow as a cost to liberal arts, or are they reflected as a cost in the upper discipline areas?
They would be
So
in
we
the upper
can look, they would
disciplinary.
be, those hours are going to be in the upper level. Now, in terms of the
Reflection would be
disciplines,
different.
it might be interesting to see, because I think you could have, sometimes we see students with a lot of excess hours or students who change majors a lot and who struggle and fail courses, and you might be more likely to find them. Obviously, they're going to be upper level if they're nearing the end of their education, but you might be more likely to find them in the less expensive fields, maybe less likely in engineering and things, or you could see the opposite of that, which is why it's worth looking at. We could see some of our very strong students who do, for example, a lot of dual credit and finish associates in high school, who then get to universities. They end up with excess hours if it's not well aligned in terms of the transfer. Some of this comes to transfer issue, but if it's not well aligned, it could be you'll have people ending up in engineering courses where they're at a point where they've got excess hours because they did a lot of hours prior to getting there. So I don't know sort of where those hours would fall, so I think that's a good idea for us to look and get a sense of what disciplines we find them in.
That would be helpful, because we're seeing an increase in excessive hours because of the populations that we're trying to reach, and also for there are students who have to drop out and work. They come back to school, they change their major. So we're seeing a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of transfers from community college coming in with a lot of hours. So this is a real critical issue, I think, for state discussions.
And we have looked at it, and although I think there's different patterns for why students who have attended more than one institution are more likely to have excess hours. So we're happy to dig into this a little more deeply. This is something that just came up, so I was happy we could at least look at percentages and give you some sense of the total number of hours that aren't being included.
Good, thank you. Well, I think that concludes most of the conversations we've had, unless I've missed something from working group members. Anybody have anything that I failed to mention? So that concludes our report. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gallant. I think that we are now at a point to kind of summarize the action items coming out of our discussions today. If I look back at charge number 1, I think there was, I think the first thing discussed is a request to look at the small institution supplement at the 27.4 as it was in the last legislative session, and then using the same methodology of adjusting for inflation and running those numbers, again, using the methodology used in the last biennium. We looked at the 1.3 number plus inflation. There was also, I think, agreement on the technical clarification for Sol Ross RGV to be a separate line from Alpine for the formula data for utilities when that is run. And then we would bring back to this committee in October to look at a recommendation as a whole for charge 1. Did I miss anything on charge 1? Okay. Charge 3, I think I was tasked with trying to put everybody's eloquent words into a motion to bring back to the committee next time, and I hopefully have captured that, but I might be reaching out to some of you offline before the next meeting to make sure that I have that captured correctly. In charge 4, I think that is coming back to the committee in October to specifically have more information from the coordinating board on the legislative and statutory requirements.
And we'll make sure to invite staff who will be able to answer some of those detailed questions about the beyond time aspects of this. And I think we can add to the materials. I've got the statutory language here. It's quite long, but we can share that with the committee as well. So we'll put that on our to-do list to share that information out. And if it would be helpful maybe to sort of summarize what happened during the session so we could get that in writing, and I can make sure you're provided what we couldn't today, but I'll make sure we also have some expertise at the next meeting if you have additional questions once you see that.
For the committee members that didn't serve on the negotiated rulemaking to see what the allocations are.
Okay.
If we could model Susan Brown's suggestion.
Okay.
And then we could go from there.
Sure. Yeah, that would be helpful.
I also think if we modeled running the 26 million through the outcomes-based model from last session.
Okay.
Would be helpful as well for the committee.
Yeah, we're happy to do that.
I like that.
And that would be from the session, so that would just be for the students who were at risk in terms of the allocation. Okay.
Okay, then, and finally on charge 2, I think that we just discussed that, but I heard 2 different things. One is that we just need confirmation that all of the expenditures are being captured for all hours taught. And then the second, now that we have the information on unfunded hours, it'd be helpful to see the split between three-peat and excess hours and where they fall within discipline and level.
Yeah, the other thing I want to ask, if you want us to prepare for the next meeting, is we had been asked by the work group and in conversations with Dr. Gallant about just putting together a matrix that shows the actual cost per SCH, so and maybe doing that for a couple of biennias so you could see those costs over time. And we didn't have the opportunity to provide that yet. Is that correct? So that's something that we'll...
The cost
Yeah, it's sort of the conversations that we had around, rather than just have the index so you can see that it's a 1 for liberal arts and a 24 for pharmacy, you know, that...
It's already in there. It's right underneath the...
Oh, so that's actually in the packet. So
No, it's in the, it's with the, every time we do the expenditure study, right below the weights, those numbers.
Okay, and we had talked about maybe providing something with the comparison data so we could look over the last couple biennia over time and just see, to show the increase in those costs rather than the index indices, but just the increase in what those costs have actually been over time. Does that sound like our conversation? So if it was 100, we remember you were talking about the 6% increase at one point, so you would be looking at something that would show an increase in that liberal arts rate if, in fact, the affiliated cost per SCH had gone up. We can look at that from a couple biennia ago, last biennia, et
We get
cetera.
perspective from the working group and the committee and see if that's something that.
Yeah, would that be helpful to have?
I think it would.
And I think, Madam Chair, one addition to the charge too, I think we also agreed to have a recommended consistent methodology for the allocation of DOE. Did you include that in your comments? I may have missed that.
You're correct. I missed that. I will have that written up for, I think we all agreed to that, but I'll write it up formally as well, so I have all that for the October materials. And of course, I think that for charge 2, the working group may meet between now and the October meeting too, to continue our discussions. I believe for those that are interested, is it correct that that there was a PowerPoint that you had done on expenditure study, if you're interested in remaining today to go through that PowerPoint?
That's correct. Anyone who would like to stay, I've done it for this group before, so if you've heard it before, you don't feel you need to stay. We did send it out, and we included my talking points with it, so everyone received it. But if you'd like to stay, I know we had a couple of new members who were interested in spending a little time trying to better understand how the expenditure study works. So I will stay with anyone who'd like to remain and go through that.
And I have a question under the category of new business, if there's an opportunity to do that. Within, and this is a question, within the scope of our charge, is there an opportunity for us to discuss the recommendations from this group regarding at-risk students and either recommendations to do what we did last time in this committee to recommend funding for at-risk students? Is there an opportunity to have those kind of discussions within the scope of this charge? And are y'all interested in that? I'm very interested.
I'm very interested in that.
Okay.
I would be.
I'm very interested.
Because it's significant for many of us, I think, in the state, if not all.
I was going to say, I would think that would fall under charge 4 based on my
Okay.
understanding of the
Okay.
commissioner's charge and his
Okay,
intent.
so I would recommend and advocate for that if that's agreeable with everybody.
Yeah, it's a little broader than this, but I think even if, once we share the statute, you'll see it's the, the legislature finds it in the state's highest interest to evaluate student achievement, et cetera, and funding policies that promote educational success based on objective indicators of performance, et cetera, should be considered. That's kind of the flavor of the statute that ties to the committee. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or new business to bring to the committee today? If not, do I hear a motion to adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? The next committee meeting is adjourned. Our next one is October 17th at, again, 11 a.m. Thank you so much for joining today.